The first thing my neighbor ever said to me wasn't, "Welcome to the neighborhood." It wasn't, "Need a hand with those boxes." It wasn't even a simple hello. No, the first thing out of his mouth was a laugh. A real laugh. The kind that isn't meant to share a joke. It's meant to let you know you're the joke. I had just backed a rental truck into the driveway of my new house in a little subdivision outside Asheville, North Carolina. It had been a long move. 2 states, 10 hours on the road, bad coffee, worse traffic, and enough cardboard boxes to make me question every possession I'd ever owned. I was carrying a stack of kitchen boxes toward the front door when I heard somebody chuckle from across the street. I looked up. There was a man standing on his porch, leaning against a white railing with a beer in one hand. Gray hair, polo shirt tucked into cargo shorts. The kind of guy who looked like he'd spent 20 years serving on committees nobody asked for. He wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't looking at the street. He was looking directly at me. Then he turned toward a woman sitting beside him and said loud enough for me to hear every word, "Well, there goes another one." The woman frowned. "What?" The man smirked. "Another homeowner who bought a house without checking where his property line actually is." Then he laughed again. I remember standing there holding that box and thinking, what a strange thing to say to somebody you've never met. Now, most people probably would have fired something back. I didn't. I've learned over the years that certain people survive on reactions the same way campfires survive on oxygen. You give them attention, and suddenly they get bigger. So I just kept walking. But I won't lie. That comment stuck with me. Not because it upset me. Because it was oddly specific. Almost like he knew something. His name, I would eventually learn, was Gerald Whitaker. Retired. 68 years old. Former regional sales manager. Unofficial mayor of the neighborhood. At least according to Gerald. Everybody seemed to know him. Everybody waved at him. Everybody listened when he talked. And for what I could tell during my first week there, everybody also seemed slightly afraid of making him unhappy. The funny thing was, I noticed something else almost immediately. His backyard looked bigger than everybody else's. A lot bigger. At first glance, it wasn't obvious. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The fences throughout the subdivision followed a pretty consistent pattern. Same spacing, same setbacks, same alignment, except Gerald's. His cedar privacy fence pushed noticeably farther back than the neighboring properties. Inside that fence sat a beautiful outdoor setup. Stone patio, custom fire pit, raised flower beds, landscape lighting, the works. Honestly, it looked like something straight out of a home improvement magazine. The problem was, a section of it wasn't actually on his property. It was on mine. I knew that before I even signed the closing papers. Most buyers never study plats, surveys, easements, and grading plans. I do. Old habits die hard. For almost 30 years, I'd worked as a civil engineer specializing in residential development projects. I'd spent a good portion of my career staring at maps most people would throw away after 10 seconds. So when I reviewed the documents for my purchase, one detail jumped out immediately. Gerald's fence crossed the recorded lot line. Not by inches, by several feet. Enough to matter. Enough that it definitely wasn't an accident. Now here's where things get interesting. I didn't say anything. Not at first. Because I wanted information before I wanted conflict. And honestly, I was curious. Sometimes people tell you exactly who they are if you simply give them enough time. About 9 days after I moved in, I was out near the side yard after a rainstorm checking some drainage runoff when Gerald wandered over. No greeting. No introduction. No small talk. He stopped at the edge of my property and pointed toward the fence. "Just so we're clear," he said, "that fence stays exactly where it is." I actually thought I'd misheard him. I looked up. "I'm sorry." "The fence," he repeated. "It's staying where it is." Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. A warning smile. The kind somebody wears when they've been getting away with something for so long they mistake it for a right. I glanced toward the fence. Then back at him. Interesting. That one word irritated him immediately. I could see it. People like Gerald expect either submission or confrontation. They don't know what to do with calm. He folded his arms. The previous owners never had a problem with it. I nodded. Okay. The Homeowners Association approved everything years ago. Another nod. Good to know. Now he looked annoyed. because I wasn't playing my assigned role in whatever script he'd written in his head. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he finally turned around and walked away. But before he reached his yard, he stopped and looked back. And that's when he said something that would end up triggering everything that happened afterward. He smiled and said, "Trust me, neighbor, some fights aren't worth starting." At the time, I simply watched him walk away. But standing there in that wet grass, listening to the rainwater trickle through the drainage channel between our lots, I had a feeling Gerald wasn't warning me. He was warning himself, and he just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I grabbed a cup of coffee, walked out into the backyard, and started taking measurements. Nothing dramatic. No survey crew. No lawyers. No angry confrontations. Just me, a notebook, a measuring wheel I'd owned for years, and a growing suspicion that Gerald's confidence wasn't built on facts. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. The fence wasn't just slightly off. At its deepest point, it crossed more than 4 feet into my parcel. 4 feet might not sound like much to some people, but in property disputes, 4 feet is the difference between a misunderstanding and an intentional decision. And then I noticed something else. Something that bothered me far more than the fence. The grading. Now, most homeowners never think about grading. Honestly, why would they? If water drains away from the house and nothing floods, people assume everything is fine. But once you've spent decades working around drainage systems, your eyes automatically catch things. Water leaves clues. The slope behind Gerald's patio didn't match the original development plans. Not even close. After the previous night's rain, I could actually see where runoff had been redirected. The water was being pushed away from his property and toward adjacent lots, including mine. I stood there for several minutes studying the ground. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. This wasn't natural settling. This wasn't erosion. Somebody had intentionally altered the drainage path years ago. And suddenly Gerald's confidence started making a lot more sense. Because if the county ever inspected that area properly, the fence would be the least of his problems. Over the next week, I kept my mouth shut. Meanwhile, Gerald kept doing what Gerald did. Watching, commenting, patrolling the neighborhood like a retired sheriff nobody elected. One afternoon, I was unloading groceries when he called across the street. "Getting settled in okay?" His tone sounded friendly. His eyes didn't. I smiled. "Doing just fine. Good." He nodded toward the backyard. "Hate to see somebody waste money fighting battles they can't win." I almost laughed. Not because the threat bothered me, because he genuinely believed he was educating me. Like a magician explaining a trick after forgetting the audience can see the wires. The following Saturday, the neighborhood held a block cookout. Apparently, it was a monthly tradition. Long folding tables, paper plates, kids running around, too many hot dogs, not enough shade. The usual. I spent most of the afternoon meeting people. And more people I talked to, the more a pattern emerged. Everybody had a Gerald story. Every single person. One family mentioned a disagreement about parking. Another mentioned a dispute involving tree trimming. Someone else quietly told me Gerald once argued with a widow for 3 months over the color of her mailbox. But nobody ever pushed back. That was the interesting part. People complained. People rolled their eyes. People avoided him. Yet nobody challenged him. Eventually, an older woman named Martha leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You know why?" I shook my head. She glanced across the yard toward Gerald. "Because he's exhausting." I laughed. She continued. "People don't lose arguments with Gerald because he's right. They lose because eventually they're tired." That sentence stayed with me. Because she had perfectly described a certain type of personality. Not powerful, not knowledgeable, just relentless. And when enough years pass, people start confusing persistence with authority. A few days later, I made a phone call. Just one. No threats. No accusations. No drama. I simply requested a boundary verification review and drainage compliance assessment through county channels. Then I submitted documentation. Photographs. Elevation observations. Historical plat references. Survey records. Drainage maps. Nothing emotional. Nothing personal. Just facts. The county responded faster than I expected. Apparently, drainage violations tend to attract attention because they can affect multiple properties simultaneously. Funny how government agencies moves slowly until liability enters the conversation. Then suddenly everybody becomes interested. About 10 days later, a white county truck rolled into the subdivision. Then another. Then a third. I happened to be standing at the kitchen window when they arrived. And if I'm being honest, even I felt a little excitement. Not because I wanted revenge, but because reality was finally showing up. The trucks parked near my driveway. Workers stepped out wearing reflective vests. Equipment cases appeared. GPS units. Tripods. Survey poles. The real stuff. Not guesses. Not opinions. Measurements. Within minutes, curtains started moving all over the neighborhood. People were peeking through blinds. Garage doors opened. Dogs started barking. Suburban America has a funny relationship with official vehicles. Everybody pretends not to care, while secretly caring very, very much. Then Gerald appeared, right on schedule. He came outside carrying a coffee mug, walking fast. Try not to look like he was walking fast. The lead surveyor was setting a control point when Gerald approached. "Morning, gentlemen," he said. Nobody looked up. "Can I help you with something?" The surveyor checked his paperwork. "County verification order." Gerald blinked. "For what?" "Boundary reassessment and drainage compliance review." The moment he heard the word drainage, something changed. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it. I didn't, because suddenly the confidence disappeared from his face. Just for a second, a tiny crack in the armor. Then it came back, or at least he tried to put it back. "There's been a fence there for years," he said. No response. HOA approved everything. The surveyor nodded politely. HOA authority does not supersede county records, sir. Short sentence. Big impact. I was standing near my garage by then, watching quietly, not smiling, not celebrating, just observing. And somehow that seemed to bother Gerald more than anything else. The crew got to work. Control points. Reference markers. Elevation scans. Boundary verification. Nobody argued. Nobody debated. Because professionals don't negotiate with measurements. About an hour later, something unexpected happened. One of the younger technicians walked back to the truck and pulled an old development file. He flipped through several pages, then looked toward me. "You Evan Brooks?" I nodded. The technician's eyebrows lifted. "No kidding." The lead surveyor glanced over. "What?" The younger guy held up a document. He signed part of the original grading review package for Cedar Hollow Phase 2. There was a brief silence. Then both surveyors looked at me, then at Gerald, and suddenly everybody understood the same thing at the exact same moment. Gerald had spent weeks assuming I was just another homeowner. What he never bothered learning was who I actually was. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't speculating. I wasn't trying to interpret documents I'd found online. I'd spent decades working with the exact systems we were standing on. The lead surveyor laughed softly. "Well," he said, "that explains why this complaint package was so thorough." Across the property line, Gerald's face went pale. For the first time since I'd moved in, he looked uncertain. Not angry, not annoyed. Uncertain. And uncertainty can be a terrifying feeling when you've spent years believing you're untouchable. The survey work continued through most of the afternoon. Every new measurement seemed to uncover another problem. Every marker led to another question. And every question pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The fence wasn't where it belonged. The patio wasn't where it belonged. The drainage wasn't where it belonged. By lunchtime, another county vehicle pulled into the subdivision. This one wasn't from surveying. This one belonged to code compliance. And when Gerald saw that truck pull into the cul-de-sac, I watched the color drain from his face completely. Because suddenly, this wasn't about a fence anymore. It was becoming something much bigger. And standing there beneath the gray afternoon sky, watching officials unload folders from the back of that vehicle, I had a feeling the next few hours were about to change Gerald's life forever. The moment that second county vehicle pulled into the subdivision, the entire atmosphere changed. Up until then, Gerald had still been trying to convince himself this was manageable. An inconvenience, a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic headache that could be talked away. But code compliance doesn't show up because everything is fine. And deep down, I think he knew that. By early afternoon, several orange marker flags had appeared across the back portion of his yard. At first there were only a few, then more, then even more. Like someone was slowly drawing a picture he didn't want to see. One flag landed near the fire pit. Another cut through part of the patio. Several followed the corrected property line. Every new marker seemed to erase another piece of the fantasy Gerald had built around himself. At some point, his wife came outside. Her name was Linda. Nice woman. Honestly, we'd only spoken a couple of times, but she always seemed pleasant. Confused, maybe a little tired, but pleasant. She walked directly toward the officials, then toward Gerald, then back toward the officials. You could tell she was trying to understand why half the neighborhood was now watching their backyard like it was a live television show. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I heard enough. What were they talking about? That was Linda. Gerald answered quietly. Too quietly. Then she asked another question. A harder one he clearly didn't want to answer. A few seconds later, her arms folded across her chest. The expression on her face changed, and suddenly she wasn't looking at the county employees anymore. She was looking at her husband. That's when I realized something. She hadn't known. Not all of it. Maybe she knew about the fence. Maybe she knew about some of the landscaping. But she clearly didn't know how serious the situation had become. After a brief exchange, she turned around and walked back into the house without saying another word. Honestly, that silence hit harder than any argument could have. By late afternoon, the survey supervisor approached with a thick folder tucked under one arm. He stopped near Gerald, spoke calmly, professionally. No emotion, no judgment, just facts. The kind of facts that don't care how long you've lived somewhere. The kind that don't care how loudly you've argued at HOA meetings. The kind that don't care how many neighbors you've intimidated over the years. When the supervisor finished speaking, Gerald looked stunned. Completely stunned. The county had issued a formal restoration order. Everything built within the encroachment area would have to be removed. Everything. The fence, the affected patio sections, the fire pit, the landscaping structures, the drainage modifications. All of it. And it would need to be corrected according to approved engineering specifications. The irony of that last part almost made me smile. Gerald stared at the paperwork, then finally looked up. So you're seriously making me tear all this out over a few feet? The supervisor didn't even blink. No, sir. And he pointed toward the flagged areas. The encroachment is actually the smallest issue here. That sentence landed like a hammer. Because for the first time, Gerald understood what I'd understood weeks earlier. This was never about 4 feet. 4 feet was simply the thread. Once someone pulled it, the entire sweater came apart. Over the next month, the transformation was impossible to ignore. Contractors arrived. Equipment arrived. Dumpsters arrived. Every few days, another piece disappeared. First, the fence came down, panel by panel. Then sections of a stone patio were cut apart and hauled away. The custom fire pit followed. The raised garden beds vanished shortly afterward. Even portions of the decorative landscaping had to be removed so the drainage corrections could be completed properly. It was strange watching it happen. Not satisfying in the way people might assume. Just revealing, because every missing piece exposed something deeper than dirt underneath. It exposed reality. The reality that Gerald had spent years building a version of ownership that existed only because nobody challenged it. Now the challenge had finally arrived, and reality was collecting its debt. Meanwhile, the neighborhood changed too. People started acting differently. Not toward me, toward him. The authority he'd spent years cultivating seemed to evaporate almost overnight. Neighbors who once treated him like the unofficial leader of the subdivision suddenly kept conversations short. The confident wave disappeared. The unsolicited advice disappeared. The certainty disappeared. Turns out authority built on intimidation has an expiration date. Once people see behind the curtain, they rarely forget what's back there. About 2 months later, everything was finished. The drainage had been corrected. The property lines restored. The county signed off. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as suburban life ever gets. One evening, I was checking my mailbox when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. It was Gerald. For a moment, neither of us said anything. And honestly, he looked different. Older. Smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. like the weight of the last few months had finally settled onto his shoulders. He stared at the road for a few seconds before speaking. Guess you knew what you were talking about. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because even after everything, he still thought this had been about talking, about arguments, about winning, about who sounded smarter. But never was. The paperwork won. The measurements won. The facts won. All I said was, "Take care, Gerald." Then I grabbed my mail and headed back toward the house. That was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. And honestly, I've thought about that situation a lot since then. Because the Real story was never about property lines. It wasn't about fences. It wasn't even about the patio. The real story was about something much more common. People get comfortable. Then they get entitled. Then eventually they start believing that whatever they've held on a long enough automatically belongs to them. Sometimes that's land. Sometimes it's authority. Sometimes it's control over the people around them. And when that illusion finally gets challenged, they don't see correction. They see betrayal. That's exactly what happened to Gerald. He wasn't defending 4 feet of dirt. He was defending the version of himself he'd built around it. The guy who always won. The guy nobody questioned. The guy who could push a little farther every year because nobody wanted the hassle of pushing back. But eventually somebody did. And once that happened, everything changed. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had moved into that neighborhood, would you have confronted Gerald the very first day? Would you have ignored the whole situation to keep the peace? Or would you have handled it the same way I did, quietly, patiently, and through the proper channels? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always divide people. Some say I should have talked to him first. Others say he created his own problems the moment he decided that someone else's property belonged to him. I'd genuinely love to hear where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with a difficult neighbor, an HOA conflict, or someone who confused confidence with authority, share your story below. Trust me, you're probably not the only one.